And then we also wanted to show their thought process, because what's striking about this set of practitioners, teachers, professors, is that they're both very steeped in the classical medicine, all of them. They're very steeped in the classics. I mean, they know the stuff like the back of their hand. And at the same time, they've been involved in pharmacological research. So they look at, what did we do in the avian flu epidemic? And what herbs in the lab were showing up as effective? And they combine that. And I think there's a certain level of cynicism in Europe or in the States about integrated medicine, at least from some camps. And so I think part of what this book shows is that, but when you need Chinese medicine to be included in a very meaningful and very complete way, comprehensive way into a healthcare system, like when you're in the middle of an epidemic, this is what you could do.
This is another of our special edition podcasts that focuses on the coronavirus and the treatment of COVID-19. Shelley Ochs and Thomas Avery Garran, both longtime residents of Beijing, recently have collaborated on the translation of various COVID-related materials that are related to the use of Chinese medicine, and they put it into an ebook form. This is not just a collection of formulations or studies, but additionally has the thoughts and clinical experience of senior practitioners who have been boots down in the middle of the epidemic. For all y'all that don't read Chinese, this contribution to our profession will help you to get some nuance and insight into how doctors in China are treating and learning from the coronavirus and using Chinese medicine at a scale commensurate to an epidemic. The ebook is available as a free download, and you'll find a link to it over on the show notes page. I would encourage you to contribute some cash to the kitty for these two. They've done some good work and have been very generous to make this so easily and widely available. I want to apologize in advance for the sound quality. We did the best that we could, but there are challenges when you're trying to tunnel through the great firewall of China. These conversations come to you through the generous support of our sponsors and members. Blue Poppy, your new one-stop shop, has speedy shipping options on everything that you need for your clinic. It's Women's Health Month at Mayway Herbs. Check out their new website for learning resources on helping women with herbal medicine. Are you a creature of habit? How about making a change that helps your patients and the planet with AccuFast needles? And later in the show, raising your fees doesn't have to be a difficult process. Jane has helpful suggestions on making it easy and effective. And finally, have you considered that having a thriving, profitable practice is one of the most healing things that you can do? Julie Bear-Don't-Walk has, and she can help you do something about it too. Do be sure to visit the sponsors page on the Qiological website to take advantage of all the special offers our terrific sponsors have for listeners of the podcast. Picture this. Your clinic is buzzing with patients, and then you realize that you're down to your last box of needles. No need for panic, because Blue Poppy, your one-stop shop for all your acupuncture needs, they ship orders received before 3 p.m. on the same day. With a quick visit to Blue Poppy's website, you can order premium needles, herbal formulas, and that special Dr. Bob's oil that your patients love. Blue Poppy understands practitioners can't keep patients waiting. That's why they strive to get you what you need when you need it. From high-quality Chinese herbs and formulations to acupuncture supplies and clinical essentials, Blue Poppy has served practitioners for nearly 40 years with products that meet the highest of standards. Discover everything Blue Poppy has to offer by visiting www.bluepoppy.com, and don't forget to subscribe to their mailing list for exclusive offers and more.
Hi folks, I'm Yvonne Lau, president of Mayway Herbs. May is Women's Health Month, and as a women-owned and women-run business, we especially love how Chinese medicine can support wellness through every stage of a woman's life. So in this month's newsletter and podcast, we're covering topics like PMS, pregnancy, menopause, and osteoporosis. We'll share expert insights and effective treatment strategies you can put to good use in your clinic. Our Plumflower brand line includes herbal tea pills, tablets, extract granules, and organic herbs, all of which you can find on Mayway.com. and where you can also find articles, videos, and other resources to support your practice. Since 1969, Mayway has been a trusted source for high-quality herbal products. In these challenging times, please know that we remain committed to keeping our products accessible and affordable so you can take care of yourself and your patients. As always, thank you for supporting Real Chinese Medicine.
Daily habits and routines feel comforting, familiar, easy, automatic. That's the power of repetition. You've worked out the kinks and can do it with your eyes closed. But what if you shook things up? What if you ditched the old routine and tried something new? Hi, I'm John Sten. I've practiced acupuncture for over 30 years, and together with my wife Kelly, we created the world's first eco-friendly acupuncture needle. The AcuFast earth-friendly needle system cuts your packaging waste by 60 to 90%, depending upon your needle type, speeds up your needling, gives you more control, and best of all, while you're healing patients, we plant a tree for every 2 boxes your clinic uses. Thousands of acupuncturists have already made the switch. In just the last year, they've helped plant over 16,000 trees. Since we started, that number has grown to over 50,000. So break the routine. Be the change. Visit acufastneedles.com. Your patients and the planet will thank you.
And again, I deeply appreciate Thomas and Shelley for the work they've done and for making the time to sit down with me for a conversation. Let's get into this. Hey friends, welcome back to this special episode of Qiological. Today I have Thomas Avery Garran and Shelley Ochs. These are two practitioners who've spent quite a while in China. They have recently released a book on the use of Chinese medicine in treating COVID-19. It's a gift to our profession, and it's all about the various methods and ways that the Chinese have been thinking about in treating this illness in Asia. So Thomas and Shelley, delighted to have you here on Qiological.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for having us.
You two have been in Beijing for quite a while. I'm curious, first, let's get a little bit of background on you guys. What took you to China and what have you been doing there?
Well, I'll go first. In fact, we've both been in Beijing since 2007.
Yep.
We came the same year, right before the Olympics. I originally came just to study. I was at a place in my practice in Louisville, Kentucky, where I felt like I really wanted to learn more, and there really weren't any master practitioners in the region that I could easily access.
You were the master in Louisville.
Yes, that's exactly it. And there are pros and cons to that. You know, some people really groove on that. And they say, yeah, I'm ready to go back and be the teacher and just be that person. But I felt like, especially, you know, I think a lot of people experience this as you get out of school and you kind of find your way, you start changing your methods, you deepen your thinking, you learn a lot more Western medicine as people come into your clinic. And then you want to learn more. At least that's where I was, sort of 5 years, 7 years out of the gate. So I came to China, came to Beijing to study with Wang Juyi. So I studied with him pretty intensively for a couple of years. And long story short, I got married and had a child, and that changed his life. So I continued to practice and study, but at a slower pace. And then I decided that I wanted to make a long-term life here. So I went to the China Academy of Chinese Medicine, Chinese Medical Sciences, and I studied what's called Yishi Wenxian, Chinese medical history and medical literature, because that is one field in China. And I did my PhD with the person, Liu Changhua, who was the head of the institute at that time. And since then, I've been doing research and translation when I can, and treating patients. I work at Beijing United Family, a big private clinic now. And that's kind of my life, teaching, doing clinical work, and translating.
Sounds great. And Thomas, what about you?
In the fall of 2007. Same time as Shelley, and I came under a little bit different circumstances. I was at that time living in Hawaii and had just left the position as the head of the herbal medicine department at a Chinese medicine school in Hawaii, and I was looking at doing some graduate work in ethnobotany. At the same time, I was studying Chinese language and literature at the University of Hawaii. So I decided after about a year of studying Chinese there that it would really be in my best interest to come back to China and spend some time here and study language and look for, other potential study options. I really, I'm a classic foreigner, expat in China that, I thought I was coming for 8 months and it's now been over 12 years. So, like Shelley, I have done various things here and I practiced and then about 4 or 5 years ago, I decided that, but sort of by a stroke of luck, I was able to get into a position to do a PhD at the same institute, although in a different department. So I was at the Resources, Materia Medica and Resources, DDAO Resources Center also in the Chinese Academy of Chinese Medical Sciences. And I was really fortunate to have an advisor who is actually one of the people that's in the book. He was one of the four leaders on this adventure down to Wuhan. So
on the steering committee.
On the steering committee, right? Although he is not a doctor. He's a researcher. So he's actually the president of the Academy of Science, the Chinese Medicine Academy, or whatever it is, China Academy of Chinese Medical Sciences. But he's a researcher, so he's a pharmacologist. So I've been exposed to all this really amazing scientific work that's being done here in China around agriculture and even some drug development stuff. So that's kind of where I'm at right now, and sort of coming out of that and starting to do this kind of work that we just did.
Yeah, well, you guys are positioned really well with this. How did this book come about? What was the nudge that got you guys going with this?
It's funny because Shelley and I have known each other because I also studied with Dr. Wong, and I'm pretty sure that's where we met. But anyway, we both studied there, and we've been pretty good friends. And in the last, I guess it's maybe been a year or so, we've become a little closer and started talking about doing some work together. And in fact, we had decided to do another project together right before this. And it actually started a little bit on that project. And then this came about.
Well, and we did the book on growing, and Thomas said, hey, I need an English editor. And at this point, I definitely consider myself more of a acupuncturist and history person because you can't do everything. But, I learned herbs in the Chinese program back at San Francisco. And, I do some herbal medicine in my practice. I said, sure, let me look at it. I'll learn a lot. And so that's how it came about, is this very detailed book about specifically growing how many herbs? 180?
No. This only has 39. Anyone who's ever done a PhD knows that there's something you have to do for your teacher, and oftentimes in the States you're teaching or you're doing whatever it is, and here it's oftentimes you're doing some kind of translation or some kind of work for them. So anyway, I translated this book that was edited by my advisor and another one on my committee. And I needed an editor because, as you know, it's really hard to edit your own work. So
it's like impossible.
Right, exactly. So
yeah, you really need another set of eyes.
Right. So Shelley came in and basically took what I had done and made it readable, which was fantastic. And we produced a really pretty nice book, I think. And it's the only thing available in English that's really has authentic information directly from growers and researchers in China. And there's over 100 experts that contributed to the book.
I think it's interesting for people who have no interest in growing to just really realize what goes into processing and growing herbs. It's a much more detailed process than I had ever imagined,
yeah,
actually.
Actually, it was funny because we were chatting as we were going along, and she was talking about, wow, this is really fascinating. I had no idea.
I really did.
So our herbal medicine is like way more involved on the back end than most of us realize.
Exactly.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So what about this book? Other than the fact that, coronavirus is, a pandemic and it's all over the world, and what got you going with this particular book?
Well, we were sitting here, literally in China and under quarantine because everything closed, even in Beijing, which is of course quite far from Wuhan, and we were looking at what was coming out uh, in English, and we ourselves did a couple of those basic protocols, right? If you have stage A, B, C, and D, or if you want to use prevention or you're into recovery, this is our suggestion of the formula that you use. And some of those plans throw in some acupuncture points and so on. But we felt like that was the most basic information and it would be useful for people to have a lot more. So in that process of kind of thinking about what would be useful to our community and looking at what people were putting out at other sites. We were looking at Heiner Fruhoff and what came out on some of the publication sites and so on, to the Chuns. And then in China, of course, there's intense interest from the Chinese medicine community here on so many levels. And people that were still in Wuhan, the lectures that we translate in the book, all but one, I believe, actually were given when they were still in Wuhan. They gave these Zoom lectures to the community. So there's something that's really targeted very specifically at Chinese medicine practitioners. And in a sense, actually, they're targeted towards people who are seasoned practitioners who've been practicing for some time. And we felt like that was really the most useful information. And when I say useful, I mean on a couple of different levels, at least. One is we hoped that people who are doing telemedicine and seeing people over some of these platforms and so on and delivering medicines to their doors, we hope that they would be able to look at all the different formulas from different regions and then decide what might fit their climate. Because when you see the book, you'll see that they all emphasize that. It's not going to look the same in Guangdong. And in fact, there's a recent outbreak up north in Jilin. And I want to look at those formulas as well, because we're in a different season already, first of all, although not maybe it's not quite as warm up there yet, but a completely different climate compared to Wuhan or Guangzhou. So I want to see how they changed the formulas. But we felt like these lectures were very detailed. They gave a good account of what actually happens when you're in an epidemic and Chinese medicine becomes involved in that public health. They treated 50,000 people at one point. So we wanted to show that. And then we also wanted to show their thought process, because what's striking about this set of practitioners, teachers, professors, is that they're both very steeped in the classical medicine, all of them, but especially Tong Xiaolin, who apprenticed, and he has some family lineage also in his background. They're very steeped in the classics. I mean, they know the stuff like the back of their hand. And at the same time, they've been involved in pharmacological research. So they look at, what did we do in the avian flu epidemic? And what herbs in the lab were showing up as effective? And they combine that. And I think there's a certain level of cynicism in Europe or in the States about integrated medicine, at least from some camps. And so I think part of what this book shows is that when you need and want, but when you need Chinese medicine to be included in a very meaningful and very complete way, comprehensive way into a healthcare system, like when you're in the middle of an epidemic, this is what you could do. So it's a reference in terms of that.
Just to add a little bit to that, one thing is that, we talked about this a lot, is that it's a living system. It's not a static system. People sort of say, it has to be the classics. And it's like, okay, the classics are great. And that informs us. That's our foundation. But to think that Chinese medicine stopped 2,000 years ago or 1,800 years ago is insane. So I think what this shows is that you have people like Tong Xiaolin and the rest of them who are clearly, literally can quote, classic after classic line. And yet at the same time, he's thinking, okay, but this herb showed this effect in some study, whether it was a lab or it was an in-person study. And we should consider that, even though that's not part of a classic formula. We should consider how we might modify this formula with that herb. So I think that's really important. I think the other thing that Shelley touched on just briefly that I think is important about, especially the lectures, is the public health aspect, but also the protocols. Like, so there's protocols from 3 provinces and then Wuhan itself. And then there's acupuncture protocol and the recovery and the prevention protocol. Those are all put out by government bodies. And what it shows really clearly is that the government was trying its best to offer people, and not just practitioners, but also people like regular citizens, advice and things that they could do to try to avoid getting sick, or if they did get sick, what they could do to mitigate the symptoms and deal with it. And so, and the public health is also from the standpoint of the lectures. Shelley mentioned they treated 50,000 patients, but when you read those lectures, you find out that they were making these huge vats of formulas and giving, everybody got the same formula, or vast numbers of people got the same formula, but that's really the only way you could do it. And to think that you could make individual preparations, individual formulas for that many people is, of course, not really realistic.
It wasn't practical. They couldn't get the actual raw herbs. They couldn't get someone to cook them and distribute them. It just wasn't practical.
And there's a history of doing it. Even in the Zhang Boli actually mentions this, that I'm not sure which text it is because he doesn't reference the text, but how, in the past they talked about making these big vats of herbs and giving them to the whole community.
Well, and even actually people our age shared stories with me after I started writing this book about how when they were in elementary school and there would be severe influenza going around or something contagious like that, they would give them these vats of medicine at school, which you couldn't do today, actually, even in Beijing for lots of reasons. But they were doing that as preventative medicine. And I think that speaks to something that's really key in all of this, which we can unpack a little bit, is just the idea of an epidemic. Because this is a pestilent qi. We know it's a virus. We know it's a beta coronavirus related to SARS and so on, but it's pestilent qi. It's not one of the 6 evils.
So it's its own whole different thing. One of the things for me that's been interesting about this, you say pestilent qi, and yes, there's a virus, and yes, there's a thing that it's doing in our bodies, and it's virulent. It'll burn through a population, which is why isolation can be really helpful in slowing the thing down. What I've noticed with this one is that because we are so interconnected with the internet, this thing not only affects our bodies, but it very severely affects our minds at the same time. And so that's one piece, and we may come around and address that later. I'm just throwing it out there as something that I've noticed. The thing that I hear here in the States, and I think about for myself, because I'm also an herbalist, and I'm used to thinking about how it's important to create a formula for a particular person. Our medicine works best that way. And yet, when you're in a situation, I'm going to call it a public health situation, which is very different than like a one-on-one encounter. It's like, how do you deal with it when you're not dealing with like one person or a family, but you're dealing with cities or countries? And my suspicion is that's to some degree where the protocols are coming from. They're looking at how do we treat not just tens or hundreds of people, but millions of people.
Right. So I think what's really important here is to recognize that it's true. There's no question that herbal medicine works best, that Chinese medicine and herbal medicine in general works best when you can tailor a formula to a specific person, given their constitution and the symptomology that they present in the clinic at that moment, right? But clearly this is not realistic in this situation. So I think what we saw here is we saw people with extensive experience with, and I don't mean just, they didn't just read a bunch of books. They've actually worked on these other epidemics that have come through, whether it was SARS or etc. And they looked at what was happening and came up with something that was sort of, to be honest, it's a little bit frustrating. I see some people saying, "Oh, this is like a shotgun formula." Yes, it is. Absolutely okay.
But they observed.
Let's just call it that, which is really okay. Which is not to say that they tried to cover every single base that they possibly could see. What they looked at was, from my understanding, here's the major problem. They identify, okay, this is a damp toxin, right? So what can we do? What classical formulas can we look at, and how can we modify them, and how can we build something that's going to be useful for the entire population? And they modified it. They didn't just settle on one thing and then just go. There were modifications along the way. And then as they got things a little bit more under control, then they could start to divide the population into like mild and moderate and serious and critical cases, and start to integrate some of these other things. But one of the things they talk about, and it's hard for me to even wrap my head around, is arriving in Wuhan and seeing essentially chaos, where there were thousands and thousands of people. People are scared, people are getting sick, people are dying, and
everyone's all together, the relatives of the patients.
Exactly, because they don't really know what's going on yet, and there's no one that's saying, okay, wait a second, this is a very highly contagious disease. We need to separate people. We need to have a quarantine. We need to find a way to slow this thing down. And there was so much controversy around doing the quarantine, and there was a lot of sort of side effects of that. I mean, for example, there were people, listeners probably don't really realize this, but this is right literally just days before the Spring Festival was about to start. So there's all these people in transit, and there were actually people that were in Wuhan, because Wuhan is a major transit hub. So there were people that got stuck there that aren't from Wuhan, and they were going from somewhere else to their home, and they were stuck there with nowhere to go. So that was sort of like this unfortunate side effect of the quarantine. But had they not done that, I don't know. We would have seen something way worse than what we're seeing in the U.S. right now. No question about it, because, as you know, that's the largest migration in the entire world that happens every year. And so literally people were going to spread that around the country to every corner. Every single small village was going to get that. And at that point, there's just how could you possibly control it? It'd be a complete disaster. So they made a pretty harsh, and yet I think a perfectly sound decision to do what they did.
This episode is brought to you by Jane, the clinic management software that honestly just makes running a practice easier. Let's dive into something that's never easy, but sometimes necessary: raising your fees. It can feel awkward, right? But here's a tip that can really help. Consider offering flexibility to your patients as you introduce the change. When patients face new fees, it's natural for them to feel uncertain or concerned. That's where flexibility can really make a difference. Offering options like a phased increase, suggesting a payment plan, or even taking a moment to talk things through can help to ease the transition. These thoughtful gestures show your patients that you're listening and care about them, which strengthens the trust you've worked so hard to build. If you're looking for more ideas on how to navigate these kinds of changes, head to frontdesk.jane.app and check out the article, How to Tell Clients You're Raising Your Fees. One last thing, if you're ready to give Jane a try, you can use the code CHEOLOGICAL for a 1-month grace period on your new Jane account. I mean, from the point of view of the virus, it would be the perfect time to infect an entire population.
Right.
Oh, yeah. I mean, yeah.
Like, you couldn't plan it better for spreading infection.
And it's not just China, too. Of course, a lot of people these days, people that have means, they often, maybe they go home and have the New Year's Eve dinner with the family or whatever, and then they get on a plane the next day and go wherever around the world, because everyone has whatever it is, 10 days off, right. 2 weeks off. So they go literally all over the world from there. So you could just imagine what might have happened had they not done that. It's hard to imagine, actually.
It is.
The other piece is they didn't have the resources. They sent right. 30,000 medical personnel to Hubei, and They wouldn't have been able to handle a major outbreak in another province. There wouldn't have been enough ventilators. There wouldn't have been enough medical personnel. So that was a piece of it as well.
Right. Yeah. I mean, literally 30,000. Can you imagine mobilizing 30,000 medical personnel, doctors, nurses, Chinese medicine doctors, the whole gamut, go to one city?
Only in China could you pull something like that off.
Exactly.
That's right. And I want to say, Thomas touched on the chaos. One of the things that's really endeared Zhang Boli, the first lecture that we give, he's now the president of the Chinese Medicine University of Tianjin, but he was president up here in Beijing for a long time. He's 73, I believe. And 2 or 3 times he's cried on camera.
On camera, yeah.
Yeah. And he was being interviewed by a reporter when he was there for 80-something days on the front lines, came back, and he was asked about what he saw when he first arrived, and he started crying. And the reporter said, you're an old doctor here. You've been around a long time. You've seen a lot. Like, why does this bring you to tears? And at that point, he said, it's because of the suffering. He's like, the patients and the death that I saw. And it wasn't clear how we were going to be able to get this into order and how much more death there was going to be. So you'll see he has poems in the book. I mean, he's a very emotionally alive, poetic, Renaissance sort of person. And in another interview, actually, he was in what we call the 2 meetings here. He was giving his speech. It was his moment to speak. And he cried again. He was really trying not to, you could tell, but he just couldn't hold back the tears. And at that point, he said it was because of the medical personnel. Because he said, people were just exhausted. It's extremely uncomfortable, to be in those hazmat suits. You sweat and you try not to go to the bathroom because every suit costs about 300 kwai. So you don't want to have to throw one away to be able to change it and use another one. So he said the personnel was really, really overworked and to the breaking point when he arrived.
And the personnel in terms of taking herbs, were they doing these protocolized formulas or were they doing more individual? How did people stay healthy who were on the front lines?
That's a really good question. And that's part of the indirect evidence for its effectiveness is that you have a lot of reports, not only from Wuhan, but also from smaller hospitals in Hubei that say, okay, we gave this formula to everyone in the hospital. Everybody, the cooks, like everyone that is in the hospital. Yeah. And guess what? We had 0 people. We had a rate of 0% of infection among medical personnel. And they had very low rates also when they did this in Wuhan.
So I'm always a little skeptical. I was going to say, especially in China, but now with how we see the United States doing it, I can't be skeptical about just China anymore. How shall I say this? Underreported rates of infection. I remember being there in SARS back in 2003, and I remember when they finally started breaking real numbers, everybody started freaking out, but I was thinking, oh, good, now they're starting to tell us the truth. So when I hear things like, okay, they're in a hospital and they take these herbs and nobody got infected, there's always this part of me that's like, really? How do we know that?
Well, we don't, is the answer, actually. We, unless you were actually there's no way you could know for sure. And what we'll find out in 6 months or a year or 2 years or 5 years, I have no idea. I will say this, though, that from my perspective, what I can see, and that's only what I can see, that although I think there's probably numbers that, the real numbers are probably not what we're seeing, I don't think it's going to be dramatically different than what we're seeing now. I really don't. I just don't. And maybe I'm being naive, but after more than 12 years here, I don't think so. I really don't think I'm being naive.
And there's also something I would say that's I'm going to call it trustworthy about having boots on the ground there, where you're seeing it. You're kind of in the soup of what's going on. I remember, again, when I was there at SARS, it was very clear when the government was not being upfront, because all you had to do was look around you and you'd see that reality was not matching what was coming out on the news. to some degree seeing reality match what's coming out on the news.
Yeah, so I actually have a friend, and my wife has a very good friend whose family is from Wuhan. So I was in regular contact with my friend, and then she was in regular contact with her friend who was talking to her family. And so what they were telling us pretty much matched what we were hearing. I mean, there wasn't really enough of a discrepancy to think that there's like a major sort of cover up or something happening. Now, that doesn't mean that there isn't, and we're not going to find out about that sometime in the future, but
it seems unlikely.
It seems very unlikely at this point.
Yeah. Because we all have contacts. I also have 2 close girlfriends who went to school in Wuhan, and they're constantly in contact with those networks. And after the rates of infection went to 0, and this is also true in Beijing, anecdotally, I know of cases that didn't show up in the numbers. So whenever there's a few cases, you always wonder, are there more? However, I think there's enough scrutiny at this point, if nothing else, just through citizens and social media, that I think the numbers are pretty close, including there was a lot of criticism, when they reassessed the death rate. And I felt a lot of that was quite unfair. I think the government was actually quite transparent. They went back through all the records and they said, okay, some people were counted twice because they went to 2 hospitals. They were tested positive at one and went to another for treatment somehow. And there were people that died at home, and we tried to count those. And so now we think the death rate is approximately 50% higher. And I think they were trying to give an honest accounting. And we're seeing now in New York and a lot of other places as well, it's very hard to count the people that die at home.
Just go back to that word chaos. I mean, really, you lived here, and you can just imagine just the sheer numbers of people and facilities, and it's just hard to keep track of everything. And so
yeah, for the Westerners that haven't been there in that milieu, it's hard to fathom.
Right.
Yes, just the population density alone, I think people don't realize what that means.
No. It's like the most crowded day in New York every day.
Right.
It's like a parade in New York, like the New Year's Day parade or something. Every day it's like that here. So
there was a principle at work here, and I think it more or less was carried out, which is that they tried to save everyone, regardless of age. And so there's some cases that we see in the media now, people in their 80s and 90s, and even a few people that are around 100 years old. And they spared no expense, because you have to realize that this was all free treatment from the government. And now that's actually changed because they want to discourage people from doing things like coming back to China from abroad for free or potentially free medical treatment. Especially, I don't know if you've read about, there's some rather egregious cases where people knew that they had tested positive for COVID-19 and came back to China anyway. And one of them is now facing legal consequences because she knew that she was positive.
So they came back to China because they knew they could get free treatment.
Right, but in fact, there's 2 really well-known cases here. Both of those people had corporate jobs and had actually quite good, extensive private insurance. It's really just it's a mentality, we say, 占小便宜, want to get any little advantage that you can. But in general, they spared no expense, and they spared no effort, and really did try to put people before profits. And was it a perfect effort? No. Were there holes in it? Were there things we don't know? Were there certain kinds of local practices that really show the holes in the system and the incompetency and the fact that people don't want anything bad to happen on their watch? And so there was some of that.
That's just people in general, right?
Yeah.
It is, for sure. And when Shelley says, they spared no expense, keep in mind, one of the things that it's in, I think it's in John Boyley's lecture, he talks about, they contacted, drug companies or herb manufacturers and said, hey guys, we need help. And they said, what do you need? When do you need it? What can we do? And they just did it. They just did it. They didn't worry about, it might have something to do with the fact that it was John Boyley on the phone or whoever it was on the phone, but nevertheless, there was no
hesitation.
I really don't think that the people that were on the other side, on the company side of that phone call, were thinking, how can I profit from this? They were thinking, how can I help? How can we stop this as quickly as possible?
So it sounds like the culture was coming together. The country was coming together in a way that brought a lot of cohesion.
Absolutely.
Yes, it really brought people together. It really brought out the best of people in many ways.
Yeah, absolutely.
I wonder how we can get that to happen over here, because we apparently are going in the opposite direction.
Well, it has a lot to do with leadership. And I think that, interestingly, the top leadership was fairly absent for some time, at least publicly. And there's lots of speculations about why, and I don't really want to, talk about that per se. However, the leadership in general, we need to deal with this. We need to do whatever we think is right, and we need to do it now. We need to not worry about what it's going to cost. We need to not worry about people's supposed rights. We need to save people. We need to build hospitals. We need to, and they just did that. And it was really frustrating for me because when I was watching this happen here, and because I'm surrounded by my wife is Chinese and most of my friends are Chinese. Shelley's like my token foreigner friend. So we're feeling this, this cohesion, this like the country coming together. And then I'm hearing from friends and acquaintances on the other side of the pond talking about how this oppressive government is taking away the people's rights by locking them down. And I'm thinking to myself, wow, that's really hard for me to wrap my head around, because I don't see another way to deal with this.
And that wasn't the main voice here. That was a voice, but it was definitely not the majority, as far as I can tell by any means.
No, definitely not.
Most
well,
people.
It kind of gets into that whole thing of, is it about me or is it about we?
Yes. And are you willing to sacrifice your personal comfort, your personal convenience for the greater good? And I saw a lot of that. And people could articulate that really clearly. People were very aware that they were sacrificing for the greater good. Now, there are other factors, to be fair. For example, fear of death and fear of the virus. There are a lot of rumors. Though I have to say the rumors in other countries are not any less absurd than some of the rumors that we've heard here, seeing people burn down 5G towers in the UK and so on. But there was a lot of fear, because you have to realize this was the beginning. I mean, it was truly a novel coronavirus.
Right.
We didn't know what it was going to do. Was it going to lead to a lot of long-term effects like the fibrosis that was caused by SARS? I mean, we didn't know. And they actually solved fairly quickly that there was asymptomatic transmission. It took a while for that to be confirmed, but sporadic reports of that came out actually really quickly in China. People just were paying attention.
Right. So I think fear is, obviously it's a pretty strong motivator, but here probably more differently than especially in the US, where you have people that are acting this macho thing, like, I'm not going to give in to this thing that could potentially kill me. People here are like, well, if it could potentially kill me, I'm going to do everything I can do to avoid it.
And they're willing to do that. Well, I'll just stay home.
It seems to me that because in China there's more people, and because in China they've got a lot more experience with epidemic disease than we do in the United States, we're kind of new to that rodeo.
For sure.
Whereas in Asia, you can pretty much expect every couple of few years something's going to burn through the population. Maybe not a pandemic like we have, but there'll be a SARS, or there'll be an avian flu, or there'll be a something. It just seems to me there's more, I'm going to call it cultural memory, about what these things can be like.
Well, I think you might want to look at the various flu viri that have infected the United States, and how the public health community has dealt with those compared to how the public health community has dealt with them here. And I think, there have been some pretty serious outbreaks that have killed a lot of people in the United States and other places, but they're viewed differently in the public health community and the community of the society at large than they are here. Here, there's a very strong aversion to anything that might injure you. I mean, it's fascinating to see the way parents or my in-laws think about these things. I mean, for them, for example, like, so I play hockey, but for them, that just seems like that's just too dangerous. Like, why would you ever do something that was so dangerous? And I'm like, well, it's fun. Mm-hmm. But it's just, so what I mean, so what I'm trying to say is it's just a non-starter. So in the case where there's this potential danger from a virus, it's just so programmed culturally to be averse to that kind of danger.
So there's an yin and yang to that, right?
Yeah, for sure. And so now now we're in this place where we've pretty much opened up. For example, I can go to my office. They don't even take my temperature anymore, which is not true in every situation, but in my office, it's like that now. And there's a lot of people, even on the street now, that are starting to not wear a mask.
Yes.
But, like I was telling Shelley, we had a meeting last week in town. And when I came out of the meeting, there was a pregnant woman and her mom or someone, walking on the sidewalk. And I saw the moment that the mom saw me without a mask on, and she like stiffened up and immediately like directed the pregnant woman out into the street to go around me. So there's still a lot of fear, and part of that's because I'm a foreigner, part of it's because I'm not wearing a mask.
Part of it's ignorance, because at a certain point, cases were only coming in from the outside. And even though 90% of those were actually from ethnically Chinese people, that message doesn't always come through.
Right. Yeah.
Well, those foreigners.
Right.
Yeah.
It's true in any country.
Absolutely.
Same thing over here.
And we're lucky that in general, there's been no violence. I have heard of a couple sporadic cases.
There were some problems. Yeah. And Guangdong.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, yes, of course.
Against the African community. Yeah. That was kind of serious. People were thrown out of their apartments.
Don't overlook that. Yes, absolutely.
That was bad. But I think they've gotten that under control at this point.
One of the things I haven't had a chance to look all the way through your book, but I've gotten through a little bit of it. One of the things I was very impressed with is at one of the temporary hospitals, Zhangbo Li and Liu Qingquan, was it the Jiangsha temporary hospital?
Yeah.
They talked about that they weren't necessarily, I'm using air quotes here, treating patients, but they were doing what they were calling, again, air quotes, service to patients. And that service to patients very much included things like listening to them, being attentive to them. I mean, things that we often say are missing here in the doctor-patient relationship in general, but that there was this like air of caring, and people were doing like Qigong, and they were getting gua sha, and they were attended to. They were actually cared for by other human beings that were looking out for their well-being and taking herbs. And evidently, the rate of people that went from like mild or moderate to worse was extremely low.
Right. Yes, it was 0 in that hospital, and most others overall, it was between 2 and 5%. But I also was really struck by that. I thought, wow, they have a holistic model of healthcare delivery. They celebrated birthdays, sure people felt cared for and listened to. But there's been a lot of talk about that also in terms of recovery, that people had trauma, especially people that ended up in the hospital and on ventilators. I mean, it's traumatic to not be able to breathe. It triggers your whole nervous system, your whole spirit, and many people came close to death and then survived. So there is discussion about healing the trauma. So this holistic model of treating people in the temporary hospitals really included, of course, just creating a community and making people feel safe. And now that we're dealing with recovery instead of people being treated for the disease, the government is also trying to figure out ways to get people psychological counseling for trauma, to sort of create online groups of people that all suffered from COVID-19. But there is an acknowledgement at this point that people are going to need some psychological support. So I want to give listeners a more complete picture of what happened here. So you had communities of people that were in Wuhan and who had potentially been exposed to the virus through neighbors and family members and so on, especially in the beginning, before people knew they had to quarantine and practice social distancing. So that was one population. And then you had people who had mild and moderate disease, who were in these temporary shelter hospitals. And then there were people that were in the hospital wards. And then some of those, if they became more critical, they were moved to the ICU. And so in the hospitals, people were getting individualized decoction medicine. In fact, in the ICUs and all the doctors, there have been several biomedical doctors as well, who've commented on how harmoniously the teams worked together. The Chinese medicine doctors were changing these formulas. They said sometimes 3 times a day. That's something you hear quite frequently because it's the nature of the disease. They said 1 minute someone is fine and talking to you, and the next minute they can't catch their breath and you don't know to use the ventilator, or they're using ventilators and they're out of sync with the ventilator. And so I also want to say in those situations, they were using more than just herbal medicine. They were using acupuncture. There have been several accounts about how acupuncture was key to saving lives, actually, when people were not getting the oxygen exchange they needed with the ventilators, acupuncture. And that it really impressed some of the biomedical doctors on these teams that saw this. And the general feeling that you get when people talk about this is that it was a beautiful cooperation, that people were really setting aside their affiliations and their previous prejudices. And of course, there are prejudices on both sides of the medicines, right? They were setting all that aside and saying, what can you do? What can you do to save this patient? And people were allowing all of that to happen. So in the ICUs, they were doing acupuncture and they were also doing massage and they were using plasters. And as people were getting better, they were using ear points and even teaching them to do a sort of sitting baduanjing, the 8 pieces of brocade. So just to kind of give a fuller picture there.
And just to add one little thing to that is when they were giving herbal medicine, in a lot of cases, they were actually giving injections.
Yes.
Which we don't have access to, or you don't have access to there, of course. But it's a very interesting thing. Like they talk about this formula that has large doses of ginseng, and when blood oxygen levels were dropped really low, they were giving significant amounts of ginseng in injection, and it was very quickly making a marked change in their blood oxygen level. And I think I can imagine that for a Western medicine doctor thinking, because the only option they really have is to do the ventilator, and when that goes south and the blood oxygen is dropping, and suddenly you do this injection of this herb, which many of them think is just voodoo or whatever, and they can see right there on the machine,
the numbers don't lie.
The numbers don't lie, and then the patient starts to feel better. So I hope that from this, there'll be a better cooperation between the Western medicine community and the Chinese medicine community, because that's not always as cooperative as some people might think it is. Not here. So it's not maybe so far apart as it is in the United States, although in some ways it is. I know some Western docs here, and they just they know what I do and they think I'm crazy.
Right.
Maybe they don't think I'm crazy. They just think that it's unscientific, and I'm not talking about Western medicine. I'm not talking about Western medicine doctors. I'm talking about Chinese Western medicine doctors.
Right. Yes. Well, because either way, it's a point of view. Right. We think our medicine's the real thing, and those guys over there, well, we don't know what those guys are thinking.
Right. I'd like to get past this turf thing. Really, we're all trying to help people heal, and we have a different point of view, and we see how the body functions differently, but ultimately our goal is the same.
Yes.
And so I really don't have any issue with people who practice Western medicine, except for when they practice it poorly. But I have the same issue with Chinese medicine people who practice it poorly, or any type of medicine when they practice it poorly. It has nothing to do with the medicine; it has to do with the person practicing it poorly, right? So I don't have a bias in Western medicine. And there's a lot of great things in Western medicine. They do a lot of things really, really, really well. You know, some of that stuff that Chinese medicine can't do.
Well, it has seemed to me over the years that the trick to practicing medicine well is to get the patient what they need when they need it. If you happen to have that, that's great. If you don't happen to have that, make sure they get it somehow.
That's exactly right.
And if I step out off the curb and get hit by a bus, I'm really not interested in seeing an acupuncturist.
Not right away.
No.
Well,
not right away. No. I mean, no. I want to see the paramedics, and I want to probably are going to have to see a surgeon.
Having a thriving, profitable practice is one of the most healing things you can do as a healthcare practitioner. Because a robust business is the ultimate expression of vital qi. And that's the heart of our medicine. I'm Julie Bairdontlock, and I help practitioners grow nourishing, profitable, authentic businesses that embody the generative cycle of Chinese medicine. This isn't about all yang all the time. It's about expanding your own internal capacity, growing collaborative relationships with your patients for ethical patient retention, and marketing as an extension of this medicine, not a necessary evil. You already know that everything is connected in your patients' lives and bodies. The same is true for your business. When we align your systems, your schedule, your pricing, and your offerings with you, we create flow, which means more spaciousness, more impact, and more joy. When you are in the flow, fully resourced in terms of chi, time, and money, your business becomes a source of healing, not just for your patients, but for you. Let's grow something rooted, radiant, and real. Visit lifeflowconsulting.com to learn more.
So you guys, in many ways, you're in Beijing. I wouldn't say that's ground zero, but you're close to ground zero. And certainly because you're in China, you're in that soup. You've got a sense of what this thing has been, and you've had this opportunity to watch how the Western community has treated this, to see how the Chinese medicine community has treated this, and more importantly, to see how the communities have come together to treat this illness. I'm curious to know what you're thinking about in terms of the future. Viruses don't go away in a season. Generally speaking, it's something that we as human beings sort of co-evolve with.
Yes.
And generally speaking, with pandemics, there's a second wave or a third wave, right? We're just getting through the first one here. I'd like to get your perspective on what we might be watching out for in the fall or next year, or, somewhere in the next 24 months. What are your thoughts from what you've seen there and where things are right now?
Well, I think, first of all, on an institutional level, this is going to be a real turning point in China for Chinese medicine. I think a lot of people that were very skeptical before are really looking at this and saying, wow, if you can be helpful in this kind of situation with an acute contagious disease, then there's something we need to look at here in terms of what's the strength of Chinese medicine and where should it be incorporated. So there's a lot of talk now about educational reform. Some people at the Beijing University of Chinese Medicine just put out an article saying we need to include Chinese medicine more meaningfully in the emergency rooms, and we need to include it more meaningfully for critical care. So I think that may happen, and it happens to be at a time when there was already mounting government support, and I think this will just sort of segue into that. Now, I think as a clinician, both thinking about us as individuals and as a group, I think this really leads us to reflect upon some interesting questions. One is epidemics, like we've talked about before. An epidemic is something different. It generally manifests in similar ways in populations. And how do we address that in Chinese medicine? So the idea of prevention, I think, is something that we need to start thinking about. Personally, I'm not really optimistic about the development of a vaccine. I think that certainly not my field of expertise, but looking at all kinds of cases, for example, relative of someone who was very seriously ill. She tested positive, she was asymptomatic, but she doesn't have antibodies. just reading about a case like this. And with SARS, they found that antibodies didn't last. Even if antibodies do actually protect you from contracting the disease, which is an open question, they don't last. So there's not really good reason at this point to think that an artificial vaccine is actually going to deliver that. So I think we need to start looking long and hard at prevention. So when this all started, people started asking me, hey, Shell, what can it take for prevention? Even, Chinese friends around me that weren't in Chinese medicine. And at first I resisted. I thought, well, we don't do that. We see something. You have a thick white tongue coat and you're telling me you get bloated no matter what you eat. You've got some dampness and spleen G deficiency. You've got something that I can treat. Your sleep is poor. And I'm tweaking that imbalance. And that's a form of, zhi wei bing, treating illness before it manifests. And so what do you do in terms of, there's this virus out there and you don't want to get it? So there are two approaches. One, the city of Beijing came out with some formulas that were actually not very aggressive. They were really in the category of what we call tea substitutes, dai cha yin. So they're just giving you a little bit of moisture, benefiting your yin a little bit, benefiting the lung qi, and that's really just a preventative from that perspective. But in other places, certainly in Wuhan and Hubei, and even in Guangdong, people were taking formulas that also included clear heat, resolve toxin herbs. Now, they weren't taking shigao, they weren't taking heavy duty doses, but they were taking small doses. So I think we need to think about that in terms of where are you? What's your potential exposure? And what does prevention mean? I think it's not as simple as just saying you want to make the body as strong as it can be. We should do that. We should eat well and exercise and maybe look at some of the things that do increase so-called immunity, but you probably need to unpack that a little bit. And then Thomas and I have been talking about looking at the microbiome. There's evidence now that the microbiome in the whole body affects the pulmonary microbiome. And looking at something through the lens of Western medicine with that kind of research might actually lead to some very interesting breakthroughs in terms of what is immunity and what can we do to increase it, and can it be specific? Because general and specific, right, are two different things.
Two different things, right? So I think, well, first of all, I agree with everything that Shelley said.
We've also talked about this.
This is not the first time we talked about this. So, but I'll touch a little bit on this idea of microbiome. It's something I've looked at quite a lot in the last couple of years, and is what led us to at least part to a project that we're working on. Which is, Chinese medicine practitioners know a little bit about our digestive process, right, and how that's really the sort of the center of our body. In fact, in the 5 phases, there was a period of time when the earth was placed at the center, right? So, and because I've been very involved in agriculture in the last bunch of years, and learned about soil ecology, and when I think about that earth phase and the soil ecology and the importance of that for it to nourish plants, which nourish us and other animals, and are sort of the basis of the entire ecological system. And then I think about the earth phase in the human body being the spleen and stomach, and that being sort of the basis of how we accumulate qi on a daily basis. So we decided that a logical step in this progression of thought was to look at the Piwei Lun and address this text. We're not going to look at it from a scientific perspective. Obviously, we're going to do what we think is justice to the text.
But there's work around that already.
Right, exactly. Because there's actually a fair bit of work.
The whole body, yeah.
Not necessarily people that are looking at it from the Chinese medicine perspective per se. There's people that are looking at the microbiome and looking at the microbiome specific to the gut, and seeing how connected it is to not only immune function, but a lot of other aspects of how the physiology in the body. So I think this is a really, and it's an emerging science for one thing, but when we look at this emerging science, at least for me, when I look at this emerging science, I am drawn back to this classic text specifically, and the importance of that text, and how important it is for us to maintain good health, starting in the digestive system, and how we can treat things both preventatively and certainly in more acute phases through that.
So it sounds like it's Li Dongyuan
Yeah, Li Dongyuan
meets the microbiome and restorative agriculture.
There you go. Something like that.
Yeah.
I look forward to reading that.
It's sort of in some ways inspired by that. I mean, for me personally, it's a text that I've been interested in for a very long time, and it makes sense. I mean, when we started talking about this was just before this started happening, and then this thing came out, and we thought, well, this is perfect because this is how we maintain health. And then, of course, it sort of morphed into like, okay, this is much bigger than that, and we need to deal with something that's more acute. That's why we released what we did. But now we're going to go back to this other place,
and we think it will have relevance. This virus is probably not going to go to others.
No, it's probably not going away.
No.
And I mean, I know the big thing over here that I hear practitioners being called to is get online and help people build their immunity, which to me is always a really curious question because we're Chinese medicine practitioners.
Mm.
So when we're talking, air quotes here, immunity, what are we really talking about is one of the questions I have.
Right.
It's not just...
And and one of the things I come back to is that strong central Earth axis working well? Do we have good digestion? Do we have good sleep? Is our system functioning as well as it can?
Right.
And so often it's the earth element that is out of whack, especially in our modern world.
Exactly.
Well, I think, yeah, you're right, especially in our modern world. But I also think that there's a reason why Li Dongyuan wrote this text now about 800 years ago or so. Clearly, he saw it as an issue then. So it's maybe seems more acute now because of the lifestyle and the kind of diet that a lot of us eat. But clearly, even 800 years ago, it was something that was important enough for him to devote an entire book to.
Well, I'll be looking forward to reading that when it comes out. We'll have to have a podcast conversation about it, perhaps.
Absolutely, yeah.
So I just want to summarize a couple of things that I'm taking away from this. I want to make sure I'm not missing any of the highlights that you guys have shared. I so appreciate the two of you taking some time and talking about this. I think for myself, one of the big things that I feel like I'm looking at the world a little bit differently now after having had this conversation is that when we're looking at epidemic disease, when we're looking at not just a few people, but thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of people getting sick, on one level, protocolized type formulas might be helpful, is what I'm hearing. And when you're dealing with large amounts of people, you've got to go at it from sort of a public health or industrialized type medicine perspective, because you're trying to take care of the sheer numbers. Yeah. And then for the more acute cases or the critical cases in China, that's when they were using Chinese medicine as we're used to thinking about Chinese medicine. And so I'm walking away from this thinking, okay, there's the usual way that I think of working. And then there's like the epidemic way of working. And it might be helpful if we readjust our thinking a little bit.
I totally agree. That was a very enlightening and thought-provoking part of doing this book for me, to think about, okay, there have been 321 epidemics, major epidemics recorded in Chinese history. And it's easy to say, okay, well, before they had biomedicine, of course, that's what they did. There was nothing else. But in the modern era, you have swine flu, avian flu, you have COVID, you had outbreaks of scarlet fever, Japanese encephalitis, and Chinese medicine played an important role in all of those. So I plan actually to write a little bit more about that in the future, because I think that's an important use of our medicine that we haven't really grown into yet in the West.
That's important. So let's just finish up here. Just to hear briefly from each of you, what would you say your takeaways are? What have you learned from doing this book?
Wow, what have I learned from doing this book? Well, one thing that I learned is how little I know about Chinese medicine. I haven't done a lot of translation. I've done some. I have another text coming out hopefully by the end of the year. So I think one of the things that for me personally was to work through some of this material with people who were approaching something that was new but also old, like that there was some foundation for in the classics, but it was a sort of new occurrence of that, and how they drew from all these texts that they had been studying for the last 30, 40, 50 years. And some of those texts I had never heard of, which for me was sort of enlightening to think like, wow, at this point in my career, I mean, I've been studying Chinese medicine for over 25 years, and there's still texts I just have never heard of that they're quoting as if they were, they wrote them themselves. So that for me was really enlightening and humbling, but also exciting. And I guess from from looking at it, that's just looking at it from sort of my personal professional development or whatever, but looking at it from the perspective of, having been stuck in my house for 3 months and watching what was happening here, and then watching it develop, overseas, first in Italy and then, in the US. On one level, it was very touching to see, not just here, but in other places as well, including the United States, the way people responded to it. It hasn't always. I mean, I think unfortunately we've touched on maybe some of the sour notes, if you will, of the way it's been dealt with in the United States. But there certainly has been a lot of pure heartfelt effort and people taking care of each other, and the human side of that and the humanness of that, I think was really, I've written a fair bit about it, and maybe someday I'll publish that. I think it was really, for lack of a better word, sort of emotionally raw and beautiful to watch the human spirit respond to such sort of devastating and chaotic situation, and with a lot of unknowns.
These kinds of moments, indeed, it can bring something out of us that we didn't know was there. It can bring out latent, aspects of us. And so often in times of difficulty, yet on one hand, you'll see people tear things further apart, but you can also see people come together in ways that you would not have imagined. I mean, there's that old thing about, in Chinese, the character for crisis, Wei Ji, is both danger and opportunity.
Right.
And it's true.
Absolutely.
Shelley, what about you? What have you...
Well, besides just gaining really another level of respect for people in our field, along with what Thomas just said, like people who really care about other people, people who really, John Bowley, for example, he had an acute attack in Wuhan and had to have his gallbladder removed. And he was trying to avoid surgery, but they said, you have to. So he went and he had the surgery. And then as soon as he woke up, he continued working as soon as he could. I mean, that's an example that's very much in the public eye, but there were all kinds of people that were delivering medicines to elderly people, even on a volunteer basis, people that normally do your kuaidi, or they deliver your food. There were all kinds of ordinary people volunteering at these neighborhood committees, all this whole network that is rather invisible to me as an expat, because I don't have to deal with them. They just came out of the woodwork, and you see all of these people, and that was very, very heartening. But in terms of the medicine itself, it's really given me a different perspective on integrated medicine. I think as a field, we need to think about what are all the different uses of Chinese medicine. Eric Karchmer has written about his interviews. You've had Eric on this podcast, interviewing people in their 80s and 90s who treated very serious diseases like Japanese encephalitis. And in fact, just a few days ago, someone who's going to be 100 at the end of this year, Lu Zhizheng, he wrote an article reflecting on what happened in 1954 in the outbreak of Japanese encephalitis just about an hour south of here in Shijiazhuang. And it's fascinating how the same questions arose. They used integrated Western and Chinese medicine. And when the Department of Health sent teams to try to determine if the Chinese medicine had been effective, because it was a question they were interested in for public health reasons, they had to send 3 different teams because it wasn't clear. And people didn't necessarily keep accurate records. And so finally, with the third team, they determined that indeed it had been effective. But it's such a parallel situation. They were giving people herbs very early, and so it prevented them from developing more serious disease. They were giving herbs to healthcare workers, and they were treating people in the community. So I think those sort of epidemiological questions will always be there. And I think as a field going forward, we need to think about what is our medicine and how do we want it to be included? I, in some ways, I'm on the opposite end of the spectrum from the people I was translating because I've moved more towards mind-body medicine. And that's what I see in my clinic. And in fact, at this point, I treat sort of half Chinese people and half expats. That's what I see because I'm in this urban situation. And I see a lot of insomnia, depression, anxiety, and so on. But that's not all Chinese medicine can do. Chinese medicine, if given the opportunity, can also be a part of emergency medicine, be a part of critical care, and be a part of this greater healthcare system and healthcare policies. So I think that I hope that this work will also help people to think about that, maybe think about it in creative ways, think about it in ways that are appropriate or could work in the United States. You know, a lot of us, I myself included, when I went to school in San Francisco, we worked at free clinics. We would treat whoever came in the door. Haight-Ashbury's been doing that for years, and lots of other clinics, you know, treating people with dual diagnosis that have mental health issues and also have drug addiction issues, and getting some really interesting results. So I saw that out of this as well, you know, from a different perspective. So I'd like to see more of that happening.
Well, again, thank you, both of you. It's been a little bit of a rough ride today with the VPNs and internet and time zones and all that. So very much appreciate your patience with all this. I hope this comes through in a coherent way for our listeners. Mm-hmm. We've been talking about this book of yours. I'm going to put information for it on the show notes page so people can just go there and click over and get it. But if they're just listening and they want to go find it on the internet, where would they go?
They go to passiflorapress.com, and from there it'll be pretty obvious, I think.
Okay. And you guys are putting this out for free, but you're inviting people to make donations if they'd like to.
I just want to speak to that just quickly, because that was something that came up for us earlier, and we decided, whatever, you know, it's not really why we're doing this. And but when I made the announcement last week, I got several people on the announcement itself, and then I got several emails saying, really, you guys, you deserve something, you should do this, and whatever comes. And so I talked to Shelley about it, and we decided, okay, I'll go ahead and put a thing up there. So if people want to donate, they can. If they don't want to, that's fine. It's certainly not a requirement.
Well, I just want to make the comment that it's helpful for everybody that when you receive something of value, you exchange something of value. That's how the chi keeps moving. Well, here we are at the end of this episode. If you've listened up to this point, you're either a rabid fan of Qiological or the forward button on your podcast player stopped working. If you are indeed a fan of the podcast, you can help us to bring new episodes to our community of practitioners by supporting us with a membership or a one-time contribution. Details, of course, are on the website. That's it for today, friends. Join us again next Tuesday for another thoughtful episode of Cheological.